Hello and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is most of the music. That intro music was from Rawan Roshni, an amazing musical creator I just met at the MAPS Psychedelic Science conference in Denver. The song is called Sirat al-Ishq. As always, nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm not a physician. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. This will be a bit of an unusual episode, as instead of doing a deep dive into a topic entirely of my choosing, I will be responding to one particular issue that seemed to hover over the Psychedelic Science conference all week. And that is the topic of the collective Israeli trauma induced by the October 7th attacks. Now, before I dive in, I do want to give a massive shout out to MAPS, that's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, for creating this space. Whatever you think of MAPS as an organization, there's really something incredible about being in a space filled with thousands of people who just want to talk about drug policy, culture, and the psychedelic experience. Rick Doblin has created something amazing here, and I was so honored to be a small part of it. Now, on to the issue at hand. A sizable amount of programming had to do with the healing of trauma from the October 7th Hamas attacks. As most of you know, on October 7th, 2023, militants from Hamas and other Palestinian armed resistance forces broke out of Gaza and launched a well-coordinated attack on Israeli border towns, kibbutzim, and the Nova Music Festival. During this attack, over 1,000 Israelis were killed, including civilians, and several hundred were taken hostage. Talk to anyone in Israel, or even anyone with friends and family in Israel, and they'll all probably tell you the same thing. It was a horribly traumatic day. Most everyone in Israel either knows someone who got killed or taken hostage, or knows someone who lost loved ones. And in case anyone is unclear on my own position, the October 7th attack was a war crime. But I'm going to be very blunt in my assessment of where things stand in 2025. The trauma that many Israelis endured that day has been used to justify the genocide in Gaza. The genocide is ongoing, as is the weaponization of trauma as a justification for war crimes. This violent retribution is not limited to Gaza. Since October 7th, Israel has also bombed Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and is currently bombing energy infrastructure and apartment buildings in Iran. If the trauma experienced by innocent Israelis on October 7th is a weapon of war, then MAP's effort to heal and recover from that trauma and to reach net zero trauma in Israel and around the world should hopefully aim to impose peace. With Israel the primary aggressor in a conflict that has the potential of spiraling into World War III, addressing the core justification for Israeli aggression has the potential to save millions of lives around the world. But to do this, it must do more than heal the survivors of violence, but channel that healing into meaningful political outlets for peace building. It's also worth noting that MAPS Israel's effort at healing the traumatic wounds of 10/7 survivors may have contradictory effects. Anything that heals the trauma of Israelis has the potential to cool down the country's bloodthirsty nationalism that has engulfed its politics. And when I say bloodthirsty nationalism, I promise you, I am not being hyperbolic. A March 2025 poll from Penn State found that 82% of Jewish Israelis support the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, aka the Trump plan to forcibly resettle Gazans in other Arab countries. A smaller, but still significant, 47% support outright genocide of captured Palestinian cities, killing all inhabitants, such as in the biblical conquest of Jericho. As uncomfortable as these statistics are, genocide is more popular in Israel than Donald Trump is here in America. Undoubtedly, some of this hatred is a response to the mass collective trauma of October 7th, which means addressing this trauma at a root level, at least theoretically, has the potential to change the public sentiment that is driving the ongoing genocide. But MAPS Israel is not just a research organization. It's an advocacy group, the Israeli arm of the most prominent psychedelic association on the planet. They're presenting these findings all over the world, including here in the United States at the largest psychedelic conference ever. Shining a spotlight on Israeli trauma from a Palestinian military campaign that took place 2 years ago serves to manufacture consent for ongoing military aid to Israel among an increasingly potent faction of American civil society. I'm speaking, of course, of psychedelic advocates, who are no longer a fringe group, but occupy positions of power in our government, military, and other influential institutions. And given the stakes of the decisions that the State of Israel is currently making, which I'll discuss more at the end of the episode, I'm sorry, but any invocation of Israeli trauma is to be regarded with suspicion. Compassionate suspicion, sure, but suspicion nonetheless. The author Naomi Klein, Jewish-American author, wrote a great book years ago called The Shock Doctrine, which is more relevant now than ever. I highly encourage you to read it if you aren't familiar with her work. Anyways, Naomi Klein wrote a piece in The Guardian a few months back about how this whole industry of dark tourism has popped up in Israel since the October 7th attacks, ostensibly to memorialize and bear witness to the horrific violence that Hamas unleashed that day. But people within Israel and all over the world now come out to the sites of the massacre, including the Nova Music Festival site. And one particular chilling detail she described is how, while you're visiting these sites, you can hear the sounds of bombs falling just a few miles away in the Gazan cities of Jabalia and Khan Yunis. On days where the bombing is heavy, you can feel it rattling your bones. And we know what's being bombed over there. Anyone who's paid attention to social media over the last 2 years knows it isn't just Hamas command and control centers. It's UN schools, it's hospitals, it's universities, it's apartment buildings. And lately, as the bombing and blockade continue, it's tent cities filled with displaced people and aid distribution sites. All of this you can hear from the Nova Festival Memorial site. But the goal of this dark tourism is not actually to bear witness to trauma, but to selectively keep trauma alive. Israelis can come visit the site of the trauma, relive the events in graphic, immersive detail, while also completely disconnecting from the sounds of fresh trauma being inflicted so close by that if it weren't for the fence, it would be walking distance. When I hear Israeli researchers talk about the transformative potential of taking psychedelics to address collective trauma, I think of something I read in a book about the psychedelic counterculture. I believe it was Acid Dreams. And it was about the divide between white and black radical spaces in terms of the suspicion with which they viewed psychedelics. Obviously, there were psychedelicized black radicals in the 1960s, including in groups like the Black Panthers, but they were not the majority. And for many black people, life was enough of a trip. Psychedelics were largely an escape for the financially well-off but spiritually alienated white children of the oppressive 1950s, who gravitated to these substances not just because of their profound benefits, but because they had the financial stability to process and integrate the experience, to drop out of mainstream society without crashing and burning. For many black people who have been robbed of generational wealth through decades of redlining and discriminatory policies, there was simply no space in life to take in a psychedelic experience and get benefit from it. And similarly, I think the ability of Israeli survivors of mass violence to heal from that violence using psychedelics, that in and of itself is a marker of privilege. Because after 10/7, the violence ended for most Israelis, including the survivors of the massacre. The same cannot be said for for Palestinians in Gaza. Nearly all of them have been displaced, usually more than once, and countless have died, probably hundreds of thousands. Even in the West Bank, settlement expansion, home demolitions, and settler violence continue to make it impossible for Palestinians to heal from collective trauma. The creation of that trauma is ongoing. Now, at the MAPS conference, the panel on the Palestinian experience of psychedelics and trauma made exactly this point. The panelists made the very important distinction between PTSD and chronic traumatic stress disorder, which is something very universal to the Palestinian experience. For many Palestinians, there is no post-trauma, and there never has been. And I want to give MAPS credit for including the Palestinian perspective in the programming for this conference. It was a very beautiful panel, and MAPS has actually created a decent amount of space for Palestinian voices throughout the conference. In fact, Rowan Roshni did the opening performance in the very first session of the conference. She's a Palestinian diaspora musician from Jordan. But just a couple hours after that panel on the Palestinian perspective, I walked over to one of the multiple talks put on by MAPS Israel. Now, the leaders at MAPS Israel, much like Rick Doblin himself, are what we might call liberal Zionists. Now, what is liberal Zionism? It's the still fairly widely held belief that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, that the people of Israel are mostly good, and that most of the wrongdoings of the state of Israel can be blamed on a few characters within the far-right government like Netanyahu, or settler extremists like National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Oftentimes, liberal Zionists speak quite eloquently about the humanity of Palestinians and the ultimate goal of a two-state solution, and such was certainly the case in this panel. The main presenter was a woman named Karen Sephardi, who is the executive director of MAPS Israel, and she was presenting alongside Adar Avnon, an Arab mental health practitioner who's also involved with MAPS Israel. And the whole purpose of this presentation was about the challenges of doing MDMA-assisted trauma therapy for Palestinian citizens of Israel. At first, I was surprised by what I was hearing. Jewish and Arab psychotherapists working side by side to address trauma in the Israeli Arab community. And then I started to understand what I was witnessing. Pretty much the entire focus of this talk was on these Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, those people are legally Israelis. They have Israeli citizenship, some of them serve in the Knesset, a few of them are even Jewish by faith. All it means is that they're ethnic Arabs who were living in historic Palestine before 1948 and were not ethnically cleansed during the Nakba. Of course, these people still get subjected to extreme racism. In fact, that same Penn State poll I talked about earlier showed that 56% of Jewish Israelis want to deport all Palestinian citizens of Israel. But functionally, legally, they're Israelis. And as the talk drew on, I started to get this queasy feeling inside of me. I began to get this sense that focusing on the trauma of Palestinian citizens of Israel, while barely discussing the trauma of Palestinians in Palestine, was a smokescreen to put a kinder face on the state of Israel for a psychedelic audience. Because Palestinian citizens of Israel proper are intentionally kept as an ethnic minority. They're given democratic rights, the right to vote and run for office, because the Israeli government knows there will never be enough of them in power to end the apartheid in the West Bank or the genocide in Gaza. This talk ended and then went right into another talk about a topic I actually found quite interesting: the use of MDMA-assisted therapy for healing the trauma of the survivors of the 10/7 attacks. Part of why I find it so interesting, the 10/7 attack may have been one of the few instances of a mass casualty event where a large percentage of the people were on psychedelics at the time. I'm specifically talking about the Nova Festival massacre. Nova was a psytrance festival and the majority of the attendees were on LSD, MDMA, or drugs that are similarly psychedelic or empathogenic like 2CB. Now the question they want to ask here is this: did the presence of these drugs help people avoid developing debilitating trauma, or did it make the trauma worse? Now, I've tried both LSD and MDMA, and I personally had serious doubts about whether LSD could possibly have any benefit in this situation. It's a classic psychedelic, a class of drug that is often called a non-specific signal amplifier because of its propensity to make good situations and emotions feel amazing, and dark situations or emotions feel like plunging directly into the depths of hell. As it turns out, I was at least partially wrong. According to self-reports from a sample of Nova Party survivors, 75% said LSD or other classic psychedelics helped them survive the attack as it was happening. For empathogens like MDMA, the number was higher at 79%. This is less surprising to me. Drugs like MDMA allow for the patient to relive traumatic memories in a way that is proven to be therapeutically beneficial without re-traumatizing oneself. So it would not surprise me if MDMA exerted some kind of neuroprotective action on the survivors of this massacre. That being said, how does MAPS Israel intend to measure trauma, or lack thereof? If you're still calling for Gaza to be leveled, if you're not advocating for peace and an end to the genocide, did the MDMA really work? MDMA-assisted trauma therapy for 10/7 survivors is so incredibly, cynically useful for the Israeli government. For one, it reminds the world that Israel is a leader in scientific research and technological development. It serves to burnish Israel's reputation as a liberal, progressive country, even as it's increasingly being recognized, correctly so, as a right-wing, theocratic rogue state. And it advances research that might one day be useful on the battlefield. Already, MAPS is talking about the potential for MDMA to be used in the toolkit for active duty soldiers, and I'm assuming this applies to both American soldiers and the IDF. But all of this relies on the therapy not being too effective. Because if the LSD or the MDMA totally dissolves your ego, that should also include ego-adjacent concepts of nationality or ethnic superiority. And if the MDMA really opens your heart up to feelings of love and forgiveness, that should include love not just for the people who got killed in 2023, but people who are getting killed right now. Unfortunately, we know that there isn't necessarily a contradiction between spiritual practice and genocidal views. Not everyone who achieves a transcendent spiritual egoless state actually returns to their sober life with love for all of humanity. A recent expose from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz went into depth on the yogi Nazis, that's their words, not mine, who are more than able to compartmentalize their New Age spiritual practices with their complete dehumanization of Palestinians. One of the women profiled for this article spoke gleefully about this compartmentalization, saying that she has, quote-unquote, a message to everyone who doesn't understand how it's possible to be spiritual, to teach yoga and hold retreats, whilst calling for the expulsion and annihilation of your enemy. She goes on to say, I love my people with an undying love, and I hate my enemy with an undying hatred. One does not contradict the other. And she makes sure to clarify exactly what she means by enemy, saying, we are committed to take revenge and destroy Gaza, from infant to old woman. I'm sure many of these people have been able to deeply address their own trauma through their spiritual practices, but they have no qualms about traumatizing millions of Gazans just a few miles away. In fact, causing more trauma is not only a perfectly acceptable outcome, but actually the goal for large swaths of Israeli society. And this brings me to my last point. Just last week, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Iran. The strike was unprovoked. Iran did not attack Israel, and there's no compelling evidence to the claim that Iran was about to complete or use a nuclear weapon. At the time of writing this, Israeli airstrikes have killed around 700 Iranians, and retaliatory strikes from Iran have killed around 25 Israelis. War crimes, including attacks on hospitals and civilian infrastructure, have been committed by both sides. Any discussion about treating and preventing severe trauma, including by organizations like MAPS Israel, must be accompanied by anti-war advocacy. And it must be honest about the political reality of this war. Karen and Adar from MAPS Israel were supposed to present in person, and they couldn't, because all flights out of Israel have been suspended. They live in cities that are getting bombed, and they're getting bombed because Israel chose to launch an unprovoked attack on a large, well-armed country on false pretenses. This war with Iran will one day be remembered as a repetition of the Iraq War disaster, based on a similarly spurious justification of nuclear non-proliferation. And it is not just Israel's war. Donald Trump just announced, like literally right as I was recording this, that the United States just bombed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. We are dangerously close to entering a full-blown war with Iran on Israel's behalf. And yet, none of the presenters addressed this at all, instead using weasel words like the situation with Iran. So I'll end with this. If you're someone working with an organization ostensibly tasked with the treatment and prevention of trauma, especially if you're in an organization that has the public profile of MAPS, and you aren't actively fighting to stop a war that has the potential to kill millions and traumatize even more, then you need to be in a different industry. And yes, I give MAPS credit for highlighting the Palestinian perspective. But frankly, they treated pro-Palestine voices the same way they treated the opening land acknowledgements, as if this genocide were a horrible wrongdoing that had been committed long in the past, and not a mass atrocity that is active and ongoing. And if you're not willing to be honest and courageous about the political realities of the present moment, then you aren't doing advocacy and you aren't healing trauma. You're just doing propaganda. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is Drug Cultures. As always, if you like what you heard, give the show a follow on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod, shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com, or give the show a follow at consciousness_cultures on Instagram. That's consciousness_cultures. Stay safe, everyone. It is a scary time to be alive right now.